right, so let's pick up our reading at verse 15 now. And he says, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters." You see, before he had talked about suffering for the name of Christ, and now he says, this is completely different. This is not what I've been talking about, Peter says. In essence, he says, if you're a Christian, none of you should suffer as a murderer. In other words, Christians shouldn't be a murderer, somebody who takes another person's life. And he says, let none of you suffer as a thief. That's one who is a pilferer of somebody else's goods, a robber or a thief. And let none of you suffer as an evildoer. An evildoer, this word is a very general, broad word that just means to engage in any kind of evil or something that's untoward or contrary to what God would want a person to do. And the fourth thing that he mentions, let no Christian suffer as a busybody. It's how the New King James translates it. It's the idea of somebody who is a meddler in somebody else's business. It's not just a slanderer or a gossip, but it's actually getting involved in other people's business that you have no business being in. You see, as a Christian, he says, you shouldn't suffer in any of those things. As Christians, we shouldn't engage in that kind of activity. In fact, there's almost an idea behind that is if you are guilty of those things and you suffer, well, that's what you deserve. There's a just penalty that comes along with violating laws of the land or the laws of God. So he says, let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or as an evildoer or as a busybody. If you're a Christian, you shouldn't be engaged in those kinds of things in your life. Verse 16 says, yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. You see, if you suffer as a Christian, he says, that's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not a matter of I should feel bad or embarrassed or ashamed because I'm suffering for doing right, that I'm trying to live a Christian life, I'm trying to be faithful to God, and as a result of that, I'm suffering. He said, don't be ashamed of that. So he asked, have you ever suffered as a Christian? Have you ever suffered for doing the right thing? Maybe it was at work. Maybe you were called upon by the boss or by just practice and so on to do something that was questionable, or maybe it was even wrong, illegal. And you were called upon to do that, to be successful or to make it go in this company. And as a result of your faith, you said, well, I'm a Christian. I can't lie. I can't cheat. I can't violate the law. I'm not going to do that. And maybe you got fired, or you were reprimanded, or you were passed over for a promotion that you could have gotten. That's suffering for the name of Christ, or for the cause of Christ. That's suffering as a Christian, because you've done something that's right, and then been held back or been punished as a result of that. He said, don't be ashamed of that. Maybe somebody is listening that your spouse left you because of your faith, and you just weren't willing to give up on your faith. You weren't willing to turn your back on your faith, and as a result, your spouse said, I'm not going to deal with this anymore, and they leave, and you suffer as a Christian. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't feel embarrassed because you suffered for doing the right thing. You shouldn't feel bad about that. And so what Peter says is, rather you should glorify God and know that you're being Christ-like. Our mission statement here at Central is to glorify God and be Christ-like. We glorify God by the way that we live, and if we are living like Christ, if we're Christ-like, we should expect that suffering is going to come along the way. That's exactly what Peter's been saying over and over again. That Christ suffered and was glorified, and we can suffer and be glorified. And so now we live in this time of suffering in the hope of glory. So maybe you say, well, I've never suffered like that. I've never faced those things that you're talking about as a Christian. So let me suggest to you that you prepare yourself now, because there may be that day that comes. Get yourself ready and your faith strong enough that if suffering does come your way, that you will remain faithful to God. Think of some things. What are you going to do? How are you going to do that? How can you prepare yourself, your marriage, your family, to stand with God no matter where this nation goes, no matter what the direction of life is? You say, I'll stand with God. I'm going to be a Christian. And if I suffer, I suffer as a result of that. Again, some tough things. Difficult for us to consider and challenging for us to remember. All right, let's wrap this up today by looking at these next couple of verses, next few verses. He says in verse 17, "For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God?" That's a very strong statement, and says that, okay, judgment's going to begin with us. We're going to be the ones that God brings into judgment first. And the point of this is, if that's the case, and that it is, how much more difficult is it going to be for the person who's never given their life to God? What do they have to look forward to, since judgment is that place? Now, I want you to know at verse 17, the phrase, or the two words, "has come," in the New King James says, "For the time has come for judgment to begin in the house of God." Those are inserted by the translators. They've been added. The verse really reads, "For the time of judgment to begin at the house of God, and if it begins with us, what will be the end of those who do not obey?" The point seems to be doubly emphasizing that judgment begins with those who belong to God. And then two things are clear. Christians are going to suffer, which we've already pointed out. And as this says, Christians will be judged. So if Christians are going to suffer, and Christians are going to be judged, and be able to glorify God if they suffered as a Christian, what about the woeful side of those who are not Christians? How difficult it will be for them. Someone who comes to Christ, if they believe they just get off and everything's okay and no problems, no, he says suffering's going to come and judgment's going to come. Did you have any grand illusions when you became a Christian? The idea that, well, once you obeyed God, things were going to be a whole lot easier. Life was going to be so much softer or easier or smoother for you. And then you come to find out that, wow, I still have the same temptations. I still have the same challenges. And now the devil's working overtime to try to get me back. Sometimes we have some delusions about what we think Christianity is going to be, but it is important for us to realize that Christians will suffer and Christians will be judged. Peter goes on to say that the righteous are scarcely saved. Look at verse 18. "Now, if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodly and the sinner appear?" That is, if the Christian is going to be saved with great difficulty, just think what it will be like for the person who is not a Christian. We have to go through tribulation, the Bible tells us in Acts chapter 14 and at verse 22. We must go through many tribulations to enter the kingdom of God. And if that's so, oh my, what a terrible ending for those who do not follow after God. And verse 19 says, "Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to Him in doing good as to a faithful Creator." Peter just kind of seems to sum it all up here and says, so if you suffer for doing good, if you suffer as a Christian, if you suffer in these challenging ways, then you just commit your soul to God and continue to do good. And God, who is this faithful creator, he will take care of you. Now, I know that still doesn't take away the pain and the challenge of suffering. But what Peter says is, if we keep a better end view, a big picture view of what's waiting for us in heaven, then it does give us the hope to say, you know what? I'm holding on. I'm suffering now, but I am holding on in hope of glory that's to be waiting for me later on. That's the message I want to encourage you with. That's the message I need to hear. That when I go through troubles, I just need to hold on. When you go through troubles, you need to hold on. Don't give up. Don't give in. Don't throw in the towel. Continue to be faithful to God and do good as unto this faithful Creator. He'll take care of you. He'll provide for you in the after while. All right, next week we'll turn to and go into chapter 5. We're going to talk about some interesting things there, and I hope you'll join us for that study as we look at that next week. May God bless you.